The Bandidos Motorcycle Club chapter house in East Texas had seen its share of late-night visitors over the years. But when Maria Santos appeared at their door that humid Tuesday evening, clutching a crumpled piece of paper with trembling hands, even these hardened bikers knew something was different. Her face bore the telltale marks of someone who had exhausted every other option before turning to them. Maria had lived next door to the Hendersons for 3 years, watching a marriage slowly deteriorate into something darker. What started as raised voices through thin walls had escalated into sounds that made her stomach turn. But it was the children's cries that finally broke her silence. 8-year-old Tommy and 6-year-old Sarah had become shadows of their former selves, flinching at sudden movements and wearing long sleeves even in the Texas heat. The note she handed to Sergeant-at-Arms Jake Diesel Morrison was simple but devastating. "He's hurting the kids right now. Police won't help. Please." Her voice barely above a whisper, Maria explained how she'd called Child Protective Services twice, filed reports with local police, and even contacted the school counselor. Each time, the system had failed these children, citing insufficient evidence or bureaucratic red tape. Diesel read the note twice, his jaw tightening with each word. Around him, other club members gathered, their leather vests and intimidating appearances masking the protective instincts that had drawn them to this brotherhood. They'd all chosen this life partly because they understood what it meant to stand up for those who couldn't defend themselves. If you believe in protecting the innocent and standing up for those who have nowhere else to turn, hit that subscribe button and join our community of people who refuse to look the other way when justice needs to be served. The Bandidos didn't make decisions lightly, especially ones that could bring unwanted attention from law enforcement. But as Maria recounted the children's situation in greater detail, it became clear that conventional channels had not just failed, they had actively enabled the abuse to continue. The local police department, overwhelmed and understaffed, had responded to domestic disturbance calls with routine visits that accomplished nothing more than temporarily quieting the house next door. Detective Ray Hoffman had become familiar with the Henderson address, but his hands were tied by departmental policy and legal constraints. Without visible injuries or direct testimony from the victims, building a case against David Henderson proved nearly impossible. The man was smart, calculating, and knew exactly how to work within the system's limitations. He was a respected insurance adjuster with no prior record, making authorities hesitant to pursue aggressive action. Maria's documentation painted a disturbing picture of systematic failure. She had photographs of the children's bruises, recordings of late-night screaming, and detailed logs of incidents spanning months. Yet each agency she approached seemed more concerned with liability and procedure than with the immediate safety of Tommy and Sarah. The children's mother, Linda, had become so isolated and terrorized that she rarely left the house, let alone sought help. The club members listened with growing anger as Maria described watching the children's spirits break day by day. These weren't men accustomed to standing idle while innocents suffered. Their code demanded action when traditional justice systems proved inadequate. They had seen too many cases where bureaucracy became an accomplice to abuse. As the evening wore on, it became increasingly clear that someone needed to step outside the boundaries of conventional law enforcement to protect these children from further harm. Within hours of Maria's visit, the Bandidos had mobilized their network of contacts throughout East Texas. Club President Marcus Steele Rodriguez understood that this situation required more than intimidation. It demanded careful planning and strategic thinking. The club's reputation for swift justice was well earned, but they also knew that any misstep could result in the children being placed in even greater danger. Steele assigned different roles to various club members based on their unique skills and backgrounds. Tommy "Doc" Williams, a former paramedic, would assess any medical evidence of abuse. Rick Chains Patterson, who had connections within Child Protective Services through his ex-wife, would work the official channels from the inside. Meanwhile, Jake Diesel Morrison would coordinate surveillance and gather intelligence on David Henderson's patterns and vulnerabilities. The club's approach wasn't about vigilante violence. It was about applying pressure where the system had failed to act. They understood that their mere presence often accomplished what months of bureaucratic processes could not. Their leather vests and rumbling Harleys carried a reputation that made people reconsider their actions, especially those who preyed on the vulnerable. Doc Williams began by establishing contact with the children's school nurse, who had noticed but been unable to act on signs of abuse. Through careful questioning and his medical background, he helped her document evidence that would be harder for authorities to ignore. The nurse, relieved to finally have someone taking the situation seriously, provided detailed records of the children's injuries and behavioral changes. As the club members coordinated their efforts, they maintained constant communication with Maria, who had become their eyes and ears in the neighborhood. Her courage in reaching out to them had set in motion a carefully orchestrated plan that would either save these children or expose the club to serious legal consequences. The surveillance operation began at dawn the following day, with club members taking shifts to monitor the Henderson household without arousing suspicion. What they witnessed over the next 48 hours confirmed their worst fears about the situation. David Henderson's pattern of abuse was systematic and calculated, occurring primarily during times when neighbors were least likely to intervene or when his wife Linda was too intimidated to resist. Chains Patterson's contact within CPS, a social worker named Jennifer Walsh, agreed to conduct an unannounced home visit based on the new evidence the club had helped compile. Walsh had been frustrated by the system's inability to protect children in cases like this, and she welcomed the additional documentation that might finally justify removing Tommy and Sarah from their dangerous environment. The club's investigation revealed that Henderson's abuse extended beyond physical violence. He had isolated his family from friends and extended relatives, controlled their finances completely, and used psychological manipulation to ensure their silence. Linda Henderson had been systematically broken down over years of marriage, leaving her unable to protect herself, let alone her children. Doc Williams discovered that both children had been treated at different emergency rooms for suspicious injuries, but the visits had been spread across multiple facilities to avoid detection. Henderson was intelligent enough to know that repeated visits to the same hospital would trigger mandatory reporting protocols. This revelation provided the missing link that authorities needed to establish a pattern of abuse. The evidence was mounting, but the club members knew that David Henderson was becoming suspicious of the increased attention. His behavior was growing more erratic and dangerous, suggesting that time was running out before he either escalated the violence or attempted to relocate his family to avoid scrutiny. The breaking point came on a Thursday evening when Maria's frantic call brought the club racing to the Henderson house. The sounds of violence had escalated beyond anything she had previously witnessed, and she could hear both children crying in terror. Steele made the decision that would define this entire operation. They were going in, regardless of legal consequences. 8 Bandidos members arrived within minutes, their motorcycles announcing their presence to the entire neighborhood. The psychological impact was immediate and intentional. David Henderson, who had spent years terrorizing his family behind closed doors, suddenly found himself facing men who weren't bound by the same rules and procedures that had protected him from law enforcement. The confrontation was brief but decisive. Henderson, faced with the club's unified presence, quickly realized that his usual tactics of manipulation and intimidation were useless. These weren't social workers he could charm or police officers he could mislead with carefully crafted explanations. They were men who had seen enough violence in their own lives to recognize it instantly in others. Steele's words to Henderson were simple and direct. The abuse would stop immediately, or the consequences would be severe and permanent. There were no threats of specific violence, but the implication was unmistakable. Henderson's reign of terror over his family had ended, and everyone present understood that any future incidents would result in swift retribution. If stories like this resonate with you, and you believe in communities that protect their most vulnerable members, make sure to like this video and let us know in the comments about times when ordinary people had to step up because the system failed. The club's intervention had created the opening that Child Protective Services needed to act decisively. Jennifer Walsh arrived the following morning with police backup and a court order for emergency removal of the children. The evidence compiled through the Bandidos investigation, combined with fresh documentation of Henderson's increasingly erratic behavior, finally provided legal justification for immediate action. Tommy and Sarah Henderson were placed in protective custody, while their mother Linda was connected with domestic violence resources that the club had helped coordinate. The children's removal from their father's control was traumatic but necessary, and the club members made sure that Linda understood she had support in rebuilding her life away from her abuser. David Henderson's response to losing control over his family was predictable. He attempted to file complaints against the motorcycle club for harassment and intimidation. However, his credibility had been destroyed by the mounting evidence of child abuse, and law enforcement was more interested in building a case against him than investigating his accusations against the Bandidos. The legal system, which had failed these children for months, suddenly found the motivation and resources to pursue justice aggressively. Henderson was arrested on multiple charges of child abuse and domestic violence, with prosecutors confident that the evidence would support significant prison time. His insurance company began its own investigation, and his professional reputation was destroyed. The club members watched these developments with satisfaction, knowing that their intervention had accomplished what months of official channels had failed to achieve. They had forced the system to do its job by making inaction more dangerous than taking appropriate steps to protect the children. The weeks following the Henderson intervention brought both vindication and complications for the Bandidos chapter. Local law enforcement, while privately grateful for the resolution of a case that had frustrated them for months, was obligated to investigate the club's role in the affair. Detective Hoffman found himself in the unusual position of questioning men who had accomplished what his department had been unable to do. The investigation into the club's actions revealed something that surprised many observers. Their intervention had been remarkably restrained and focused entirely on protecting the children. No laws had been broken, no violence had occurred, and their pressure tactics had simply forced existing systems to function as they were designed to do. The Bandidos had walked a careful line between vigilante justice and community advocacy. Media attention brought both positive and negative consequences for the club. Some praised their willingness to act when official channels failed, while others criticized the precedent of motorcycle clubs taking law enforcement into their own hands. The club members themselves remained largely silent about their specific actions, preferring to let the results speak for themselves. Tommy and Sarah Henderson began showing signs of recovery in their foster placement, with counselors noting gradual improvements in their behavior and emotional state. Linda Henderson, with support from domestic violence advocates, filed for divorce and began the long process of rebuilding her life. The family's healing would take time, but the immediate danger had been eliminated. The case became a talking point in discussions about the effectiveness of child protection services and the role of community intervention when official systems fail. It highlighted both the necessity of proper legal procedures and the reality that sometimes unconventional approaches achieve results that traditional methods cannot. 6 months after that desperate evening, when Maria Santos knocked on their clubhouse door, the Bandidos chapter reflected on how one neighbor's courage had changed multiple lives forever. David Henderson was serving a 7-year sentence for child abuse, his appeals exhausted and his reputation permanently destroyed. The children were thriving in a stable foster home, while their mother completed the legal and emotional work necessary to potentially reunite their family. The case had established an unofficial protocol within the club for handling similar situations. They developed relationships with social workers, domestic violence advocates, and even sympathetic law enforcement officers who understood that sometimes unconventional pressure could achieve what official procedures could not. Their reputation in the community evolved from simple intimidation to protective intervention. Maria Santos became something of a local hero, her willingness to seek help from an unlikely source inspiring others to speak up about abuse they witnessed. The neighborhood where the Henderson family had lived in terror became more vigilant and connected, with residents understanding that protecting children required community involvement, not just government intervention. The broader impact extended beyond East Texas as the story spread through biker communities across the country. Other chapters began developing similar approaches to child protection, creating informal networks that could respond when official systems failed. They understood that their reputation and resources carried responsibilities to the vulnerable members of their communities. This story reminds us that justice doesn't always come from expected sources, and that sometimes ordinary people must take extraordinary action to protect those who cannot protect themselves. If you believe in standing up for what's right, even when it's difficult, subscribe to our channel and share these stories with others who understand that protecting the innocent is everyone's responsibility.